Old Hans Keller always told it the same way. No matter who poured the coffee, no matter how hard the north wind worried the tent seams, and no matter how late the fire had burned down into a low orange bed of coals, he'd lean forward until the firelight climbed into the lines around his eyes, and he'd point his tin cup toward the dark beyond the flames, toward that stretch of prairie that never truly belonged to anyone for long. He'd say it started with something so small you'd laugh at it if you didn't know better. A barn door that wouldn't stay shut. Not because the hinges were bad, not because the latch was loose, but because fear has its own kind of weather. And that night it rolled in over Thaddius, Bear, Mallister's ranch, like a cold front made of hoofbeats. Mallister was half asleep on his cot, boots still on, because a man alone on the edge of the staked plains learns that habit or dies without it, when the horses began to breathe wrong. You ever hear that? Horses don't scream like people do. They don't tell you what's coming. They just change. A nervous snort cut short, a hoof shifting where it shouldn't, the faint clink of tack in a barn that ought to be quiet. Then came the silence. Not the peaceful kind either. This was a silence with weight to it, the kind that makes you feel like you stepped into a church and forgot why you came. Mallister sat up slow, listening. He heard the windmill give one long creak, like an old man clearing his throat. Somewhere out beyond the corral, a coyote yipped and stopped mid-yip, as if it suddenly remembered it wasn't alone out there. And then it happened. An arrow struck the barn post. It didn't come in loud. It wasn't a cannon shot. It was worse than that. It came in like a whisper that had teeth. A quick, sharp thunk, wood taking iron, and the shaft shivered in the moonlight. Black fletching trembled like it was still deciding whether to fly again. Mallister rose without rushing. Rushing gets you killed. He crossed to the cabin window and eased the curtain aside. At first he saw nothing but the prairie, a flat, empty stretch of pale grass under a bright moon. Then the darkness began to rearrange itself. Shapes slid into place where there hadn't been any a moment before. Horses. Many horses. They came without torches, without sloppy shouting, without the kind of chaos you get from drunk raiders. These men moved like a plan. A wide crescent of riders became a circle. Each one left space for the next, until Mallister's barn and cabin sat in the center of a living ring. 200 Comanche warriors, silent in the moonlight. Hans would always pause right there, letting the fire crackle while everyone pictured it. The prairie so flat the stars looked nailed to the sky. A lone rancher at the center of a perfect circle, and all that empty land around them, suddenly feeling small. Inside the cabin, behind Mallister, the small girl he'd found earlier that day sat up fast. She didn't cry, not yet. Her eyes were wide and shining, and she already knew what Mallister's heart was still trying to deny. She wasn't just hearing horses, she was hearing home. She whispered one word, soft as breath, in a language Mallister didn't speak. But he didn't need to understand the syllables to understand the sound. It was the kind of word a child says when she sees the edge of the world. Mallister stayed at the window, staring. Outside, the ring tightened. Not much, just a horse length here and there. Small adjustments, patient ones, the kind that say, "We have all night." Then a voice came out of the dark. Not shouted, not pleading, just placed into the air like a blade laid on a table. "White rancher," the voice said, in careful English, roughened by distance and smoke, but steady. "Bring the girl." Mallister swallowed. His mouth was dry enough to taste dust, and in that moment he didn't feel brave or noble or anything folks like to put on a man after he's dead. He felt small, he felt tired, and he felt the cold, simple truth of the frontier settle on his shoulders. 200 Comanche warriors don't show up at your barn by accident. They show up for blood, or justice, or war. The girl moved closer behind him, blanket clutched tight around her shoulders. She stood on bare feet, quiet as a shadow, and her small hand found the back of Mallister's coat like it was the only post left standing in a flood. Mallister had been called Bear since he was young. It wasn't because he liked fighting. It was because he moved heavy and quiet, and because he didn't waste words. A man like that learns to read a room the way he reads the sky, looking for the change that means trouble. And the air outside had changed. He could see faces now, painted, pale in the moonlight. Feathers, lances, bows held low but ready. Some rifles too, old trade guns and stolen army bases, resting across saddles like they belonged there. No one moved like they were here to bargain. Mallister's eyes flicked to the barn post again, to the arrow still quivering, a message nailed into wood.
He glanced down at his own hands. He hadn't lifted his rifle, not yet. And he knew, deep down, he probably never would. Not against that many men, not with a child behind him. Outside, the voice spoke again, patient but cold. Bring the girl. If the man speaking was who Mallister suspected, Chief White Bull, the one traders talked about with lowered voices, then this wasn't a question. It was a demand made by someone used to being obeyed. Mallister turned slightly, enough to look at the girl. She stared back up at him, her eyes huge in her thin face, and there was fear in them, yes, but also something else, recognition, a pull, like she wanted to run to that voice and also wanted to hide from it at the same time. That's how you know it's family, Hans used to say, love and terror living in the same place. Mallister faced the window again. The circle held steady, horses breathed, leather creaked. Somewhere out there a bowstring tightened just a little, a sound so soft you'd miss it unless your life depended on hearing it, and Mallister's life did. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, he could feel the cabin behind him, then walls, warm lamplight, the smell of stew and sweat and dust. He could feel the prairie outside, cold, huge, waiting. Hans would always grin just a little at this part, not because it was funny, because sometimes a man smiles when he's remembering something that could have killed him, and the smile is just his way of proving it didn't. That, Hans would say, was the moment Bear Mallister learned something no preacher ever taught right. He'd look into the fire and his voice would drop lower, like the flames had stolen the rest of his breath. Doing the right thing can sound an awful lot like a noose tightening. Then he let the silence sit for a second, long enough for everyone to feel that circle of horses around them, even out there by the campfire where it was safe. And finally, like he was turning a page nobody wanted to read, Hans would say, but if you want to understand how a man ends up with 200 warriors outside his barn, you've got to go back. Back to the start, back to the day before, 24 hours earlier.
Out there on the Texas Panhandle, McAllister's place didn't look like much, unless you knew what it took to keep it standing. One small cabin, one weathered barn, a few fences that were always half broken and always needing a man's hands on them. The rest was sky and graphs and distance, so wide and empty it made you feel like you were living on the edge of the world. That morning, the sun came up hard and white. No soft dawn, no gentle warmth, just a blunt light that flattened everything and made every shadow look sharp enough to cut. Even the dust in the air seemed lit from inside, like the prairie had decided to turn itself into a furnace. Thaddius Bear McAllister was already outside, working the fence line near a shallow creek bed that only pretended to be a creek most of the year. He had his sleeves rolled up, sweat already darkening the cloth at his back. He moved the way a man moves when he's been alone with land and animals for too long, quiet, efficient, and never wasting effort. He was fixing a post the last storm had loosened, twisting wire back into place, when something shifted in his peripheral vision. At first, he thought it was a calf that slipped through, then maybe a coyote, low and limping. But the movement wasn't right, too upright, too uneven. He straightened, squinting into the glare. A child. Small, thin, stumbling towards the water in a slow, crooked line, like the ground itself kept moving under her feet. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Her clothes were torn, not settler-made, older patterns, older stitching, bits of beadwork that had once been bright. Even from a distance, Bear could see it in the way she walked. She wasn't just tired, she was starving. Now, any man who'd lived in that country knew the rule. You didn't wait for trouble to introduce itself politely. You saw it and you met it with caution. Most ranchers in those parts would have reached for their rifle first and asked questions later, especially when the child was Comanche. The years had been tense, raids, reprisals, whispers in town. You could ride into a trading post and feel the fear hanging behind the talk like smoke that wouldn't clear. People had stories, some true, some exaggerated, about what happened when settlers and Comanche collided in the wrong place at the wrong time. Bear's hand drifted almost by habit towards the rifle propped against the post, and then it stopped. Because the thing approaching wasn't a war party. It wasn't even a rider. It was a little girl walking like she might fall over and never get up again. Bear set his tools down, slow, deliberate. He raised his hands a little as he walked, palms visible, like he was approaching a spooked horse. He didn't want to startle her. He didn't want to give her any reason, any excuse to run. He closed the distance and saw her face clearly. Big, dark eyes, cheeks hollowed out, lips cracked, the kind of crack you get when you've gone too long without water. Dust clung to her skin like flour. The wind tugged at her torn clothing and made her look even smaller. She looked at Bear with fear, yes, but it wasn't the fear of a child playing at danger. It was the fear of a child who'd already met danger and didn't have strength left to outrun it. She spoke to him in rapid Comanche. Bear didn't understand a single word, but her hands did the talking anyway. She pointed towards her mouth, then towards the creek bed. She made the gesture again, more desperate this time. Hunger, thirst, simple as that. Bear stood there for a moment, feeling the whole frontier press in on him.
He thought about neighbors like Cletus Hartwell, men who would call him a fool. He thought about the town, about the warnings, about how quickly a rumor could turn a ranch into a target. He thought about the smart thing, the safe thing. And then he looked into those eyes again and felt something tight in his chest, something he couldn't explain without sounding foolish. He took off his hat, like manners still meant something out here, and crouched to bring himself down to her level. "Easy," he said softly, mostly for her, maybe a little for himself. "I ain't here to hurt you." The girl swayed. Her knees buckled as if her body had been holding itself upright purely out of stubbornness, and stubbornness finally ran out. She started to fall forward. Bear lunged one controlled step and caught her before she hit the dirt. She was light, too light. When he lifted her, it felt like lifting a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth. Her heart fluttered against his chest like a trapped bird. She didn't fight him. She didn't even have the strength to flinch away. And that, more than anything, Bear's stomach turned. Because fear keeps you strong. Fear makes you kick and claw and scream. When a child can't even do that, it means the wilderness has already taken most of what she had. Bear held her carefully and looked around the open land. Just wind, just grass, just the hard sun. No riders, no camp, no sign of anyone else. Still, the prairie had eyes, it always did. He turned towards his cabin, the only shade for miles, and started walking. As he carried her, did he feel her trembling? Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the shock of being touched by a stranger. Maybe it was just her body struggling to stay warm despite the heat, because hunger does that, makes you cold from the inside out. The cabin door creaked when he nudged it open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was dimmer and cooler, thick with the smell of iron stove, old wood, and the faint trace of last night's food. Sunlight slanted through the window in dusty beams. Bear set the girl gently in his only chair. She sat like she didn't trust the ground to hold her. He moved fast then, the way a man does when he realizes time is a thing you can spend and you can run out of it. He grabbed the water bucket and poured a tin cup. He offered it slowly, careful not to startle her again. She drank like the cup might disappear. Both hands shook around it. Water spilled down her chin, darkening the dust on her skin. She kept drinking anyway, swallowing hard, like she was trying to fill days of emptiness in a single breath. Bear watched, helpless in the face of how small the need was, and how big it had become. He warmed a pot of beans and salt pork, simple ranch food, nothing fancy, but hot and real. He tore Brad into pieces, set it near her, then stepped back to give her space. He didn't want her thinking she had to fight him for it. The girl ate fast and silent, the way starving people do, not tasting, just surviving. Bear leaned against the table, eyes on her hands, and for a moment he told himself it was fine, that he'd done a decent thing, that he'd figure out how to get her back safely once she could stand. Then something caught his attention. At her throat, half hidden under the torn cloth, a necklace. Not the cheap beads traders sold, this was careful work. Shell and dark bead in a pattern that looked like it meant something. And in the center, a polished piece of bone shaped like a small crescent, etched with fine lines. Bear felt his blood cool. He'd seen something like that before, near a trading post, on a Comanche rider who carried himself like a man used to being obeyed. Folks there had called him White Bull. Bear didn't know much about White Bull, only what men whispered, that he could gather riders quickly, that he didn't forgive easily, that he held his people together when the world tried to split them apart. And if this necklace was what Bear feared it was, then the girl in his chair wasn't just lost, she was important. She was the kind of important that made men ride hard and shoot fast. Bear's mind ran through options and found none of them clean. If he tried to move her now, she might collapse on the trail. If he sent word, it might take too long. If he did nothing, someone would find those tracks leading to his door. And he already knew what those tracks looked like. Bare feet in the dust, then his own boot prints joining them. A story written on the ground. The girl finished eating and blinked slowly, as if her body was finally remembering it could rest. Her eyes lifted to Bear for the first time without pure fear in them. She said something quiet in Comanche, and her expression softened. Maybe gratitude, maybe just relief at being alive. Bear nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He pulled his only blanket off the cot and draped it over her shoulders. The girl curled into the chair and fell asleep within minutes, head tilted, mouth slightly open, one hand still clutching that necklace like it could keep her from disappearing. Bear stood there for a long moment, watching her breathe. Outside, the wind kept moving across the plains as if nothing had changed. But somewhere out beyond that cabin, farther than Bear could see, closer than he could guess, a Comanche scouting party found the trail. Small footprints, then a grown man's boot prints beside them. And when the lead scout looked up towards the horizon, he didn't need the wind to know what it meant. He swung up into his saddle and rode hard back towards the camps. By afternoon, Chief White Bull was already mounted, and the distance between a good deed and a death sentence started shrinking fast.
Later on, when people asked how it all truly started, it wasn't Mallister who told it best. It was old Hans Keller, because Hans had a way of borrowing a man's memories and handing them back like they were his own. Hans wasn't at the ranch that morning. Back then, he was just a skinny boy with dusty boots, riding freight between a sod town and a trading post that sat out on the prairie like a stubborn splinter. But years later, he worked for Mallister, and he heard the details so many times he could see them when he closed his eyes. He'd tell it like this. Inside the cabin, the light was cooler than outside. The sun still poured through the window in bright, slanted bars, but the shadows had a softness to them, like the walls were doing their best to keep the harshness out. Mallister set the girl down on the only chair he owned. Not a fancy chair, just rough wood, worn smooth where a lonely man had sat too often. The girl sat stiff at first, like she didn't trust the chair, or the floor, or the whole idea of being indoors. Mallister moved fast, not frantic, just practiced, the kind of quick a man learns when he's pulled calves in a storm and potched his own cuts with whiskey and grit. He filled a tin cup with water and offered it gently. She drank like the water might vanish if she blinked. Her hand shook so hard the cup rattled against her teeth. Water spilled down her chin, carving little dark paths through the dust caked on her skin. Mallister watched her swallow and felt something tighten in his chest. Not pity exactly, something closer to anger at the land itself for doing that to a child. Then he warmed what he had: beans, salt pork, a bit of bread that was already turning hard at the edges. Nothing special, but the smell of it seemed to wake something in the girl. Her eyes followed the bowl the way a starving dog watches a bone. Mallister set it close and stepped back. He didn't hover, he didn't crowd her. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, letting her decide if this was a trap or mercy. The girl ate fast and silent, not even chewing proper at first, just swallowing, catching her breath, swallowing again. She didn't look up, she didn't speak. She focused on the food like it was the last solid thing left in the world. Mallister should have felt relief. He should have thought, good, she'll live. Instead, as he stood there watching, his eyes caught on something at her throat. A necklace. At first it was just a glint, a pale curve near her collarbone, half hidden under torn cloth. Then she shifted, and the whole thing showed itself. Careful beadwork, shells worked into a pattern, dark beads set with a kind of purpose that told you it wasn't decoration. In the center hung a polished piece of bone shaped like a small crescent, etched with fine lines. Mallister's stomach dropped. He'd seen that bone before, or something close to it. Not on a woman, not on a child, on a rider. There'd been a day at the trading post under a flag of truce and a sky so clear it looked sharpened. Mallister had been there to barter for nails and coffee, and a Comanche group had ridden in quiet as smoke. They hadn't come to laugh or drink or pick fights. They'd come like men stepping onto enemy ground for business, expecting trouble and refusing to show it. One rider had carried himself different than the rest, bigger through the shoulders, older, calm in a way that people move out of his path without knowing why. The traders had called him White Bull. That wasn't his real name, just the English name settlers pinned on him because they didn't know how to say the truth of him in his own language. But even translated, the name carried weight. Men at the post lowered their voices around it. Some said he'd held bands together after sickness and war tried to scatter them. Some said he could gather riders fast enough that a mistake made at breakfast could cost you everything by nightfall. Mallister hadn't spoken to White Bull that day. He'd only watched him. Watched the beads across his chest. Watched the way the other Comanche glanced to him before making even small choices. Watched the way the traders smiled too wide and kept their hands where they could be seen. Now, standing in his cabin, Mallister looked at the girl's necklace and felt the air change. This wasn't a random lost child. This was blood. This was status. This was the kind of missing that doesn't stay missing. His hand hovered over the pot, frozen halfway between motion and thought. He could have done the smart thing then, maybe, the safe thing. He could have dragged the girl to the edge of his land and prayed her people found her before something else did. But the girl was already reaching for the bowl, hands trembling, eyes hollow. And Mallister, Bear Mallister, with all his hard edges and lonely habits, couldn't bring himself to turn a starving child into a problem he shoved back into the sun. So he gave her the food. He watched her eat until her shoulders stopped shaking, until the desperate edge in her movement softened into exhaustion. She finished the bowl and sat there breathing like she'd just run a mile. Then she looked up at him. For the first time, her eyes held something other than fear. She spoke quietly in Comanche and touched her fingers to her chest, then pointed at him. Maybe it was thanks. Maybe it was her name. Maybe it was just her way of saying, I see you. Mallister nodded. He didn't trust his voice. He pulled the only blanket off his cot and draped it over her shoulders. The girl curled into the chair and fell asleep fast, the way children do when their bodies finally decide it's safe enough to shut down. Her mouth hung slightly open. One hand still clutched that necklace like it might keep her from disappearing again. Mallister stood there a long moment, listening to her breathe. There's a particular sound a quiet cabin makes when you're alone. Wood settling, a faint tick in the stove, the wind scratching at a window seam. That day those sounds felt different, not comforting, not familiar. Like the house had noticed the guest. Mallister walked to the table and sat down, staring at his own hands. He thought about what he should do next. Ride her back? Where? He didn't know where the nearest Comanche camp lay. Send word? To whom? The nearest post was a long ride, and by the time word got there, the girl's people might already be moving. And he knew something else too, something that made his skin prickle. The trail outside. Bare feet in dust. Then his own boot prints joining them. In that country, tracks weren't just tracks. They were testimony.
They were a story the land told to anyone who could read it. Mallister told himself maybe no one would see it. Maybe the wind would wipe it. Maybe the world would leave him alone for once. But the world out there didn't leave anyone alone for long. 20 miles away, give or take, depending on how a rider chose his line, a Comanche scouting party found those prints. The lead scout dismounted and crouched low, brushing his fingers over the marks the way a hunter reads blood on grass. Small bare feet, a child. Then larger boot prints alongside, deep in the dust, heavy steps, a grown man's gait. The scout looked up toward the horizon and didn't need anyone to explain what it meant. He swung into the saddle and rode hard. By afternoon, the message had reached the camps. The lodge flaps lifted, voices tightened, horses were caught and saddled. A kind of quiet urgency spread through the people like a shadow crossing water. And Chief White Bull, who had been a man of control and patience in other moments, was already mounting, his face set in a grief that didn't show tears, the kind of grief that turns into purpose. He didn't ride like a man looking for lost tracks. He rode like a man riding to settle a wound. Back at Mallister's cabin, none of that was visible yet. The sun still shone, the wind still moved the grass. The girl slept under his blanket like she belonged there. Mallister stood by the window and stared out at the empty land, feeling something cold settling behind his ribs. Not fear exactly, not yet. More like the first tremor before thunder. He'd done one simple thing. He'd fed a starving child. And somewhere beyond the reach of his fence, the prairie had already started carrying the news.
The sun was sliding west, dragging long shadows behind every fence post like the land was trying to pull itself away from nightfall. Out on Mallister's place, the light didn't soften the way it did back east. It just changed color, white to gold to copper, then dropped out from under you. Bear tried to keep his hands busy. He checked tack he'd already checked. He walked the yard like he was counting boards. He looked at the horizon so often his eyes started to ache. The girl was inside, asleep in his chair, wrapped in his only blanket, and the quiet of that cabin felt fragile, like the slightest wrong sound could shatter it. Then hoofbeats came up the dirt track. Not the soft, distant kind you could ignore. These were fast, purposeful, the kind that said somebody had made up their mind and didn't like the conclusion. Bear stepped onto the porch just as 3 riders came into view through the dust. Even in the fading light, he recognized them. Cletus Hartwell rode in front, jaw clenched, hat jammed low like he was trying to push the whole world down. Behind him was Deputy Amos Rudd, sitting stiff in the saddle with his badge catching what little sun was left. And next to the deputy, Reverend Pike, thin as a fence slot, eyes sharp, the kind of preacher who could make a man feel guilty just by breathing near him. Bear moved down off the porch before they could dismount. He kept his voice low, already hoping to keep the girl from waking. Cletus didn't share his hope. "Bear Mallister," Cletus barked before his horse even stopped. "You got a death wish you ain't told the rest of us about?" Bear held up a hand, palm down. "Don't holler." Cletus swung down hard, boots hitting dirt, dust puffing around his ankles. "I'll holler if I please. Morrison, my father, sent word from town, and Amos here's seen smoke up on the hills." Deputy Rudd tipped his head toward the horizon. Not cooking smoke, signals. Bear's eyes flicked that direction. The hills were a dark line now, but he could imagine it. Thin threads rising and breaking in the wind, messages carried faster than any rider. Reverend Pike leaned forward in his saddle, voice lower, almost gentle. "Son, you got any idea what folks are saying?" Bear didn't answer right away. His gaze slid to the cabin door behind him. The latch looked ordinary. The wood looked ordinary. But it felt like the thinnest wall between a child sleeping and a storm gathering. Deputy Rudd cleared his throat. "Word is Chief White Bull's child went missing 3 days ago. Hunting party got caught in a storm, and the girl wandered off. The Comanche been searching all day." Cletus cut in, pacing like a man trying to outrun his own fear. "They're not searching polite, Bear. They're searching with anger, and when Comanche get angry, they don't come in small numbers." Pike's eyes narrowed at Bear. "You found a child, didn't you?" Bear felt his mouth go dry. He could have lied. He could have sent them off with a shrug and a closed door. But these men were neighbors, the kind you traded tools with, the kind who might pull you out of a ditch if the wagon broke. Flawed, loud, frightened, still neighbors. "She's inside," Bear said quietly. "Half dead when I found her. I fed her, let her rest." For a moment nobody spoke. Even their horses seemed to hold still. Reverend Pike was the first to break the silence. "Son, do you understand what you've done?" Bear's voice came out rougher than he meant. "I helped a hungry child." Cletus threw his hands up. "That's exactly the problem. They're not going to see help. They're going to see you with White Bull's daughter behind your door." Deputy Rudd's face tightened. "They'll think you took her." Bear stared at him. "She came to my water." Rudd shook his head like it didn't matter what's true if nobody believes it. White Bull's known to wipe out a place for less than this. Cletus stopped pacing and jabbed a finger toward the darkening land. "If he rides with men, not 10, not 20, enough to turn a ranch into smoke and splinters." Bear's mind flicked through options like cards in a losing hand. "What do you want me to do? Ride her out right now, in the dark? She can barely stand."
Deputy Red's shoulders slumped. I have to report this. It's my duty. But I'll give you a head start, Bear. Get her back to her people before they find her here. Bear almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. And how do I approach a Comanche camp without getting filled with arrows? You want me to ride in waving my hat like I'm headed to church? Reverend Pike looked pained, like he wished prayer could fix geography. No good choices, son. Cletus stepped backward, already wanting distance, or warning the others. If Whitepole decides to make an example, he might not stop at your fence. Deputy Red mounted up. I'm riding to town. Folks need time to bar their doors and get women and kids inside. If this turns into war, it won't be just you. Pike hesitated, eyes on Bear. God be with you, he said, and it sounded less like comfort and more like a farewell. Then the three of them rode out, hoofs thudding, dust trailing behind. Their silhouettes stretched long and thin in the last light, and when the sound finally faded, Bear realized how quiet the ranch truly was. Too quiet. He stood there a moment longer, watching the road where they disappeared, then turned back toward the cabin as if moving would keep his thoughts from catching up. Inside, the girl's breathing was soft and steady. She hadn't woken. That simple sound, air in, air out, felt like the only thing in the world that made sense. Bear sat at the table and stared at the corner where he kept his most prized possession, a small tintype photograph. His wife, Clara, his boy, Samuel, both gone 3 years now, taken in a collar a week that moved through the territory like fire through dry grass. The photo was worn from his hands. Beside it sat a few dried wildflowers he replaced when he could, small, stubborn bits of beauty that didn't ask permission. He ran his thumb along the edge of the tintype, slow and automatic. A man alone starts talking to objects without noticing. Outside, the wind picked up. It pushed against the cabin like a curious animal. The porch post creaked. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and let out a low, uneasy sound. Bear stood and went to the window. The sky had gone the color of old steel. The last strip of orange near the horizon was thinning, like someone wiping it away with a dirty rag. He thought again about saddling up and trying to find the Comanche camp, but he didn't know the land like they did, and he wasn't foolish enough to believe a lone white rancher could ride into Comanche country at night and come out alive just because his intentions were good. He thought about loading the girl into a wagon and heading for town, but a wagon left tracks like a confession, and arriving with Whitepole's daughter in the back wouldn't look like rescue. It would look like theft. There were no clean exits. Every path led to the same thing. A confrontation. Then something caught his nose, faint at first, then unmistakable. Smoke. Not from his stove, not from his chimney. This was smoke carried on the wind from far away, thin and deliberate. Signal smoke.
They didn't announce themselves with war cries. The Comanche didn't need noise to be frightening. They arrived the way the night itself arrives, quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere. The moon was up, pale and sharp, turning the prairie grass into a field of silver blades. Mallister felt it before he saw it, the air tightening, the horses breathing wrong in the barn, the yard falling into a kind of silence that didn't belong to nature. Then shapes began to form beyond the corral. Riders spaced out with intention. No lanterns, no careless shouting, just the soft, controlled sound of hooves and leather. A wide crescent became a circle, and the ranch, his cabin, his barn, his small patch of hard-earned order, sat in the middle of it like a coin on a table. Mallister stepped outside before panic could make decisions for him. He raised his hands high, palms open. He left his rifle where it was, not because he trusted them, but because he understood what a rifle meant against that many men. A rifle was courage right up until it was insult. Behind him, in the doorway, the girl appeared. She'd been asleep. Now she was awake in an instant, blanket clutched tight around her shoulders. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just stood there and stared into the darkness like she recognized the shape of what was coming. Then she moved closer to Mallister, close enough that her small hand found his coat and held on. Out in the ring, horses stood almost motionless. Moonlight caught war paint and feather, and the occasional dull glint of metal. Bows were held low but ready. A few rifles, too, old trade guns and taken pieces, rested across saddles. Mallister had lived in the Panhandle long enough to know a simple truth. Men who came like this weren't here to talk because they enjoyed talking. A rider at the front eased forward. The horse under him was broad-chested and calm, like it had been born knowing what battle smelled like. The man dismounted slowly, as if nothing in the world could hurry him. He wore a buffalo robe over one shoulder despite the night air. His hair was braided tight, black threaded with gray. His face was painted in clean lines, less decoration than declaration. Even without ever meeting him, Mallister knew who he was. Chief Whitepole. The man traders spoke of in lowered voices. Whitepole looked at Mallister, then he looked at the girl. His gaze didn't soften. In careful English, he spoke as if laying out terms at a trading table. White Rancher, you have something that belongs to my lodge. Mallister swallowed. His mouth tasted like dust and old coffee. She came to me, half dead.
White Bull's expression didn't shift. Bring her. The girl spoke rapidly in Comanche, her voice thin but urgent. She pointed toward the cabin, then to herself, then toward White Bull, as if she was trying to explain the whole day in a handful of gestures. Mallister wished, fiercely, suddenly, that he knew her language. He could speak to cattle better than he could speak to the child standing behind him. He stepped slightly aside, giving her space to go forward if she chose. She didn't. She pressed closer to him, eyes wide, like the world had taught her that running at the wrong moment could get you killed. Around the circle, horses shifted, not closer exactly, but tighter. A bow rose, then another. The air changed, the way it does right before lightning strikes. Mallister forced his voice louder so it would carry. I fed her, I gave her water, I ain't harmed her. White Bull's gaze snapped to him. Yes, and you knew. Mallister hesitated, one heartbeat too long. White Bull's voice sharpened. You knew, and you kept her behind your door. That's when it happened. The discipline showed itself. Bows lifted together. A ripple of movement, synchronized and cold. Arrowheads angled in. A few rifles shifted into better positions. You hear stories about that sound. The sound of many bowstrings being drawn. But stories never get it right. It isn't loud. It's worse. It's a whispering chorus, like dry grass being pulled tight. Like death taking a slow breath. Mallister raised his hands higher, as if the sky might vouch for him. She was too weak to travel. I was going to. To what? White Bull cut in. To trade her back when it suited you? Mallister's throat tightened. No, I wasn't going to trade anything. I'm not asking for cattle, horses, not a damn thing. White Bull studied him as if trying to find the lie hiding in his ribs. You kept her. Mallister's eyes flicked to the girl. Her fingers clenched his coat. She looked up at him, and in her face I saw something like apology, as if she'd brought this storm to his doorstep on her back. He tried again, quieter. I couldn't let a child die. For a moment, White Bull didn't answer. The circle held. The night held. The only movement was dust sliding along the ground in the moonlight. Then White Bull spoke, and his tone was colder than before. Not louder, just more final. My men rode here to punish a thief. Mallister's chest tightened. I'm not. White Bull lifted one hand. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It's the kind a chief makes when he's used to being obeyed. The warriors didn't relax, but they studied, like hounds pausing because the master hasn't thrown the command yet. White Bull's eyes moved to the girl as she spoke again. She mimed eating, then sleeping. She tugged her blanket tighter around her shoulders and pointed back at Mallister, as if to say, he didn't hide me to hurt me, he hit me to keep me alive. White Bull listened, face set in stone. He said something in Comanche toward the circle, and the murmurs quieted slightly, but only slightly. You could feel the impatience out there, the anger of men who'd written hard expecting blood and found a conversation instead. Mallister understood that kind of anger. He'd seen it in cowboys when a steer got away after an all-day chase. Multiply that feeling by grief and fear, and you got what stood outside his barn. White Bull looked back at Mallister. You kept her behind your door. That is why you are here standing in my circle. Mallister's arms were starting to shake. Holding your hands up doesn't seem like much until you've done it under the weight of 200 eyes. He forced himself to stay still. White Bull continued, and the words landed like stones. If you are innocent, you must understand something. My people do not return to their lodges with empty hands. They do not tell their wives that 200 riders came for justice and found only words. The way he said words made it sound like something weak, something that could break. Mallister's mind raced. He could feel the moment slipping away from him. If White Bull decided Mallister was guilty, the night would end in fire. But even if White Bull believed him, what about the young men out there? What about the ones hungry for a clean answer? Somewhere in the circle, a horse snorted. Someone shifted an arrow on the string. A small sound, but in a moment like that, small sounds were thunder. Mallister forced his voice steady. What do you want then? White Bull didn't answer immediately. He looked past Mallister toward the cabin door, toward the lamplight spilling onto the porch steps, toward the thin walls that had kept the girl alive. Then he looked back at Mallister and spoke in Comanche again, quiet, controlled. The front rank listened. The tension didn't vanish, but it tightened into a different shape, like a rope being gathered. Mallister realized something then. This wasn't just about him. This was about White Bull too. A chief had to hold two things at once, his own grief and his people's hunger for certainty. White Bull took one slow step closer, boots pressing into dust. Close enough for Mallister to see the fine scars on his chest, the marks of fights that had already happened long before Mallister ever built a fence. White Bull's eyes didn't blink, and in that calm, measured voice, he made it clear the talking was nearly over. The circle waited, the barn waited, the night waited, and Mallister stood there with his hands in the air, the girl trembling behind him, understanding with a cold clarity that he was no longer negotiating with one man. He was negotiating with a whole storm.
By the time White Bull stepped up on Mallister's porch, the night had stopped feeling like night and started feeling like a trap with walls you couldn't see. The cabin lamp glowed warm behind the window, but outside that little circle of light, the yard belonged to horses, shadows, and men who didn't come for conversation. White Bull didn't rush. He didn't posture either. He walked like the ground owed him room, and the world moved out of the way because it understood what he was. Mallister didn't block the door. He knew better than to stand in front of a falling tree, so when White Bull crossed the threshold, the chief entered as if it had been decided long ago. Inside, the cabin felt smaller. A cot, a rough table, a cast-iron stove, a rifle in the corner, and tack hanging on nails. Just a man's life boiled down to what he could carry and what he couldn't bear to throw out. The girl slipped past her father first. She moved toward the chair she'd slept in, potting it like she was showing him proof. Then she pointed at the empty bowl on the table. She mimed eating, then sleeping, then pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Look, she seemed to be saying. This is what happened. This is all it was. Mallister stood back, hands visible, letting the girl speak in the only way she could. He watched White Bull's face for any sign that it was working. But White Bull's eyes drifted away from the chair, away from the bowl, away from the girl's frantic little demonstration. They landed on the tintype. Mallister's photograph sat on the table like it always did, small, worn, and handled too much. His wife, Clara, and his boy, Samuel, captured in a moment where the world still pretended it was fair. Cholera had taken them both years ago, and Mallister had been living with that kind of quiet ever since, the kind that doesn't make noise but never leaves. White Bull walked to the table and picked the photograph up carefully, so carefully it made Mallister's throat tighten. The chief held it at arm's length, studying the faces like they might tell him something he'd missed. Then White Bull said softly, in English, "You keep the dead close." Mallister swallowed. A man runs out of company out here. The girl reached up and touched the edge of the tintype with one finger, gentle as a prayer. She said something slower in Comanche, like she wanted the words to be understood even across a language. White Bull listened, then translated, his voice lower than before. She says, "When you looked at this, your eyes made the same shadow as mine." Mallister's chest tightened. My boy was about her age. For the first time since the circle formed outside, White Bull's shoulders eased just a fraction. Not kindness, not forgiveness, just recognition. Two men standing in different worlds, both haunted by small graves. Outside the warriors stirred. You could hear it through the walls, a shifting, a low murmur, the restless sound of men who had ridden hard for blood and were being forced to wait. White Bull set the photograph down in the exact place he found it, as if moving it might break something delicate. Then the cabin door frame filled with someone else. A younger warrior stepped inside without asking. He carried himself like he'd never asked permission in his life. He was lean, scarred, and coiled tight, like a whip that had learned to hate the hand that held it. His eyes locked on Mallister like the white man was the last piece needed to complete an old story. The girl shrunk back instantly, pressing behind her father's leg. White Bull's voice stayed calm, but the air around him tightened. The warrior spoke rapid Comanche, sharp as broken stone. Even without understanding the words, Mallister understood the shape of them. Accusation, challenge, anger given a mouth. White Bull answered in Comanche, quieter but firm, a chief's voice, a voice that says, "Not here, not like this." The warrior didn't soften. He jobbed a finger toward Mallister, then toward the ground. A gesture so clear it didn't need translation. "Bury him." White Bull finally turned his head toward Mallister and spoke in English, like he wanted the meaning to land without confusion. He said, "My people call him Broken Arrow. He says a white man's hands on a Comanche child is a crime, even if those hands bring food." Mallister held his palms open, keeping them where everyone could see. "I didn't hurt her." Broken Arrow's eyes didn't care. The murmurs outside grew louder, like the night itself was leaning in. Mallister realized what he'd been trying not to admit. Even if White Bull believed him, this war party wasn't a single mind. It was 100 young minds and 100 old wounds, and any one of them could decide to light the match. White Bull watched his warrior, then lifted one hand, just a calm, stopping gesture. Broken Arrow's jaw worked, like he was chewing rocks, but he lowered his weapon a fraction. Not peace, just restraint. White Bull turned back to Mallister. "There is still a problem." Mallister's stomach sank. "Go on." White Bull's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the shadows of mounted men outside. "My warriors cannot return empty-handed," he said. "They rode to punish a thief. If they return with nothing, some will say I am weak." Mallister tasted dust at the back of his throat. "So do you kill the wrong man to keep your young men happy?" Broken Arrow's gaze sharpened at that, like Mallister had finally said something worth hating. White Bull didn't rise to it. He just spoke, steady as stone. "A chief does not keep people together by pleasing them. He keeps them together by giving them something they can live with." Mallister stared at him. "And what's that?" White Bull's answer came after a beat, as if he had already chosen it long before he walked through the cabin door. "You will come with us." Mallister blinked. "To your camp." White Bull nodded once, not as prisoner, not as guest, as proof. Mallister let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's supposed to make me feel better." Broken Arrow made a mocking sound in Comanche, sharp, dismissive, like the idea of Mallister walking out alive was an insult. White Bull ignored it. "My daughter says she smelled wrong smoke," he continued, "not our smoke, and she heard laughing. Men who chase a child for sport are not men I allow to walk my land." Mallister's eyes narrowed. "Outlaws," he said. "There's plenty of them hiding in the breaks." White Bull watched him carefully. "If you are truly not the thief, then you will help me find the ones who frightened her. My warriors will return with what they rode for." Mallister's mind raced. He saw it clearly now. White Bull wasn't just offering him a way out. He was offering himself a way out too. A path that satisfies justice without spilling innocent blood, if Mallister was innocent. And if Mallister refused? Mallister glanced toward the cabin window. He couldn't see the circle clearly from here, but he could feel it, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. White Bull followed his gaze. "If you refused," he said quietly, "my young man will decide for me." That was the truth of it, stripped clean.
White Bull could control them until he couldn't. Mallister took a slow breath. He thought of his ranch outside, his barn, the arrow still stuck in the post. He thought of the town down the road, full of people who'd never know why they were about to die if this turned into war. He thought of the girl, small and shaking, watching grown men argue over what her survival meant. Then he looked down. The girl stepped forward and took his hand with both of hers. Her fingers were small, but the grip was firm, like she was lending him her courage because she had a little extra now. Mallister met her eyes. In them I saw something different than earlier. Not desperation, an offer. He looked back at White Bull and nodded once. "All right," he said. "I'll come." For a moment nobody moved. Even Broken Arrow seemed caught off guard, like he'd expected fear, not agreement. White Bull's expression didn't soften, but something in the cabin shifted, just slightly, like the air had found a new shape to take. "Good," White Bull said. "Then we ride." And Mallister understood, as the wind pushed against the cabin walls and the murmurs outside swelled again, that he wasn't walking into safety, he was walking into judgment. But at least now, it wouldn't be the kind delivered in silence from a ring of bows. It would be spoken aloud in the heart of the people who had every reason to hate him. And sometimes, on the frontier, that was the closest thing to mercy a man could hope for.
They left before the moon reached its highest point, because White Bull understood something Mallister was still learning. Night doesn't get safer just because you wait it out. Night only gives trouble more time to gather itself. Out in the yard, the circle of riders loosened into motion without ever really breaking. Horses shifted, leather creaked. A few men spoke low in Comanche, short phrases that sounded like commands and prayers blended together. Nobody laughed. Nobody dragged their feet. This wasn't a raid, it was a search with teeth. Mallister saddled his horse under watchful eyes. No one touched him, but he could feel the attention on his hands like heat. Every buckle he tightened, every strap he pulled, felt like it was being judged. He moved carefully, the way you do when you're handling a skittish animal or a loaded gun. One wrong motion and the whole night could explode. He glanced back once at his cabin. The lamplight still glowed in the window, soft and familiar, and for a second he wanted to step inside, shut the door, and pretend this was all a bad story told by men who drank too much. But the arrow in his barn post was still there, and the riders in his yard were still real, and the girl had already changed the shape of his life. White Bull sat mounted near the front, his horse broad and calm as if it had never known fear. The girl rode with him, wrapped in a buffalo robe, small hands gripping the fur near his waist. She looked over her shoulder once toward Mallister. It wasn't a pleading look. It was something steadier than that, like she was memorizing his face, just in case the night decided it didn't want him alive. Mallister swung into his saddle slowly. The moment his boots found the stirrups and his weight settled into the leather, he realized how strange it was. The only way out was riding away from his own fence, with men who could have burned it down just by looking at it. The column moved, quiet, controlled. No torches, no shouting. Just a river of horses slipping into the dark. They didn't take the straight line across open prairie. White Bull's men guided the group into low ground, into shallow draws and folds in the earth that Mallister would have ridden past 100 times without noticing. The land changed under them, not dramatic like mountains, but subtle, small dips and ridges and hidden cuts that turned the open plains into a place full of cover. Mallister watched uneasy as the Comanche used those folds like they were reading a map written into the dirt. He'd lived out here for years and still didn't know the country the way they did. It was humbling in a way that made his jaw tighten. Now and then White Bull rode close, his voice low so only Mallister could hear. "You have a name that is 2 names, he said. "Thaddius," Mallister answered. "Bear's just what folks call me." White Bull made a small sound, not quite amusement, not quite approval. "A bear is strong," he said, "but a bear alone can be killed by many wolves." Mallister kept his eyes forward. "Feels like I'm learning that." For the first time that night, White Bull's mouth twitched, almost a smile, like the idea of a man understanding his weakness didn't offend him. They rode under a sky thick with stars. The air cooled, the wind never stopped. It combed through grass and tugged at loose cloth and carried the dry scent of dust in distance. The riders moved like shadows, and Mallister found himself listening to the small sounds, a horse breathing, a saddle creak, the soft clack of a bead against bone. Broken Arrow rode closer than he had before, near enough that Mallister could feel him without looking. The scarred warrior had the posture of a man who wanted a clean ending, a man who didn't like complicated truths. Mallister didn't speak to him. Words wouldn't help. Out here, silence was sometimes the only thing that didn't get you killed. As the night thinned toward early morning, the land began to break up into rougher country, shallow canyons, scrub draws, stones that rose out of the earth like old bones. The horses slowed naturally, picking their way where the ground turned uncertain. And then Mallister saw it. At first it looked like a pal sack caught on a branch, fluttering. Then the wind shifted and the shape turned, and his stomach tightened. A coyote carcass hung from the scrub tree, belly slit open, stuffed with ash. Not an accident.
Not a predator's kill, a message. Mallister's horse shied, just a half step, and he steadied it with the reins. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. I saw White Bull's posture change, a tightening through the shoulders, a stiffness that spread through the chief like ice. White Bull raised one hand. The whole column stopped as if a single rein had been pulled. Dust settled around their hooves. The prairie held its breath. White Bull spoke a short command in Comanche. Scouts peeled away instantly, fanning out into scrub and rocks. Their movement was so smooth it looked practiced, like a ritual repeated 100 times. Men crouched low, horses were held quiet. Even the wind felt muted for a moment. Broken Arrow's eyes brightened at the sight of the warning sign, like the land itself had granted him permission to get angry again. Mallister looked from the hanging coyote to the shadows ahead. Outlaws, he murmured. Men do things like that to scare folks off. White Bull didn't answer right away. He watched the darkness between the rocks as if he could see through it. Then he said low and final, "And sometimes men do things like that because they believe they own the fear." The scouts returned one by one, speaking quietly to White Bull. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. There was something ahead. A faint gray line appeared on the horizon, the first hint of dawn. The canyon shadows grew less absolute. The world didn't get brighter so much as it became sharper. White Bull looked at Mallister. "My daughter's scent of wrong smoke," he said. "It comes from here." Mallister frowned. "Wrong smoke?" White Bull's eyes stayed on the broken country. Not our fires, not cooking. Mallister sniffed the air and caught it a moment later. Thin, oily, bitter. Not mesquite, not cedar. Something harsher. The kind of smoke a man makes when he uses kerosene and doesn't care how it smells. Outlaw smoke. White Bull motioned. Half the riders peeled off wide, circling along the rim. The rest dismounted and began leading horses down into a draw, moving like cats. Mallister followed, boots crunching gravel, trying to keep his breathing quiet. He felt exposed without his horse, like he'd been stripped of the only thing that made him equal on the frontier. But he kept moving, because standing still would have been worse. They crept forward until Mallister could see the fire. Low flames between rocks, smoke crawling upward. And then the voices, muffled, careless. One laugh, high and ugly, the sound of men who didn't fear consequences. Mallister edged closer to a gap in the scrub and peered through. 3 men sat near the fire. Outlaws at the look of them. Not starving drifters either. These men had decent coats, decent gear, and horses tied nearby that looked too good for the kind of living they claimed. One horse had its mane braided, and woven into the braid were beads. Comanche beads. Mallister's stomach dropped hard. That wasn't just theft. That was mockery. That was someone wearing a piece of another world like a trophy. He glanced toward White Bull and saw the chief's face flattened into something dangerous. Not rage that needed to roar. Rage that had settled into decision. Broken Arrow crouched close to the front, gripping his weapon as if his hands had been made for this moment. His eyes had that look men get when violence finally feels justified, when they believe they're about to do something clean. Mallister swallowed, tasting dust. He had thought the worst part was surviving the circle outside his barn. He'd been wrong. The worst part was realizing how easily one frightened child could become the reason for a bloodbath. White Bull's gaze didn't leave the outlaws. He lifted one hand slowly, a restrained signal. Not dramatic, not hurried, just final. And in that moment, with dawn creeping up behind the rocks and the smell of wrong smoke in the air, Mallister understood what White Bull had meant back at the ranch. The war party hadn't ridden all that way for a conversation. They'd ridden for justice that could be carried home, and the men laughing by the fire were about to learn what it felt like when the prairie decided to answer back.
White Bull's plan was simple in the way prairie storms are simple. It didn't need decoration, and it didn't care if anyone liked it. It just needed timing. It needed silence. And once it started, it would move fast enough to leave you wondering if you'd imagined the first moment. Mallister stayed low behind a rock, dust in his teeth, eyes fixed on the small outlaw camp wedged between boulders. The fire ahead was burning wrong, thin, oily smoke that didn't smell like wood at all. Kerosene, the kind of smoke men make when they're careless, or when they don't plan to stay long enough for anyone to complain. 3 outlaws sat near the flames, close enough to warmth and far enough from consequences. At least that's what they thought. Their rifles leaned nearby, their horses were tied close. And one of those horses wore something that Mallister's stomach tightened. A braided mane woven with beads, Comanche beads, like a stolen prayer turned into decoration. White Bull crouched a few yards away, still as stone. Broken Arrow was nearby too, coiled tight, watching the outlaws like a man watching a door he'd been waiting to kick in for years. Mallister leaned in slightly and whispered, barely moving his lips, "You're going to kill them." White Bull didn't look at him. "They stole from my people," he said softly. "They frightened my child. Their lives are already spent." Mallister swallowed. He wasn't naive. He'd lived on the frontier long enough to know how this land handled men who lived by theft. But something in him still flinched at how clean White Bull sounded, how settled the decision already was. Then Mallister said the only thing he could think of that might slow the blood. "One of them might talk, might tell you if there are others." Broken Arrow made a sound through his teeth, the kind of sound that meant, why waste time? White Bull's eyes stayed on the camp. "Talking comes after the rope tightens," he said, "not before." And then it began. The first arrow came out of nowhere, quiet, quick, final. It struck the closest outlaw high in the shoulder,
and the man fell backward into the dirt like the earth had simply decided to claim him. His scream cut through the canyon, sharp and sudden, and for a heartbeat the whole place seemed to echo with it. The other two outlaws scrambled up, swearing, grabbing for weapons. One lunged for a rifle leaning against a rock. A Comanche shot cracked, rifle fire, hard and modern, and the outlaw's hat snapped off his head. He ducked fast, alive by inches, and the sound of his panic filled the space the laughter had been occupying seconds earlier. Chaos followed, but it wasn't the sloppy chaos of men who didn't know what they were doing. The Comanche moved like hunters. Arrows hissed through the air, shadows shifted from cover to cover. The outlaws fired back, wild and desperate, bullets chipping stone and snapping through brush. Mallister stayed low, watching the angles, watching the horses. And then he saw it. One outlaw broke away, bolting toward the tied horses with a revolver in his hand. If that man got mounted, he'd vanish into the breaks, and White Bull's warriors would chase him like wolves. The canyon would turn into a slaughterhouse. Mallister didn't decide so much as move. He sprang from cover and ran low, using rocks and scrub for concealment. His boots slipped once on gravel and he caught himself, forcing his body quiet again. I could feel the gunfight around him, arrows and bullets claiming space, but my focus narrowed to one thing: stop the escape. The outlaw reached the horses and swung his revolver toward Mallister, eyes wide, the kind of fear that makes a man mean. "Get back," he shouted. Mallister didn't back up. He grabbed the nearest horse's reins and yanked hard, pulling the animal sideways with all his weight. The horse surged, startled but strong, and slammed into the outlaw's shoulder like a living battering ram. The revolver fired into the air. Mallister tackled the man before he could recover. They hit the ground hard, dust exploding around them. The outlaw fought like a cornered rat, clawing, cursing, trying to bring the revolver back around. Mallister took a punch to the cheek and tasted blood. He drove his elbow into the man's ribs and rolled his feet, pinning the gun arm. The revolver slipped free and fell into the dust. Mallister held the outlaw down, breathing hard, forearm pressed across the man's chest. Then the outlaw's eyes flicked past Mallister's shoulder. His face changed instantly, from anger to raw terror. Mallister didn't need to turn to know why. Broken Arrow stood a few yards away with his bow drawn, arrow aimed directly at the outlaw's throat. The scarred warrior's face was calm in a way that was almost worse than rage. This wasn't emotion, this was certainty. Mallister froze and said one word, low and sharp. "Don't." Broken Arrow's fingers tightened on the string. For a heartbeat, the whole canyon seemed to hold still. Then White Bull's voice cut through like a knife. One command in Comanche, short, absolute. Broken Arrow hesitated. You could see it in his jaw, in the slight tremor of restraint. Obedience fought hunger. But the arrow did not fly. Broken Arrow lowered his bow a fraction, anger still burning behind his eyes. White Bull stepped closer, gaze hard. He looked down at Mallister pinning the outlaw, then spoke in English. "You stop death." Mallister spat dust and blood, not bothering with politeness. "I stop, stupid." For a moment, it felt that sentence might get him killed anyway. Instead, something unexpected happened. A Comanche warrior nearby let a short breath that wasn't quite laughter, but it was close. Another man echoed it, low and brief, like they couldn't believe the white rancher had just spoken that way and still had teeth in his head. White Bull didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched, as if he understood the shape of Mallister's stubbornness. He turned and gave a quick order. Two warriors stepped in. They bound the outlaw's wrist with rawhide and practiced motions, the kind you'd use on a horse that liked to kick. The outlaw trembled now that the fight had drained out of him. It's funny what fear does once it has time to settle. Elsewhere in the rocks, the other outlaws didn't last long. One tried to scramble up a stone face and went down clutching his leg, stopped by an arrow. Another fired until his revolver clicked empty, then threw it aside and raised his hands, sobbing promises. Promises didn't mean much out there. White Bull cared about something else: information. He crouched close to the bound man Mallister had tackled. The chief's voice was quiet, controlled, as if he were asking about the weather. "Where did you see my daughter?" The outlaw stammered, eyes darting, and then he looked at Mallister, like a drowning man grabbing for any branch. Mallister didn't offer him one. He held the outlaw's gaze just long enough to make it clear. "You don't get to hide behind me." The outlaw looked away and started talking fast. "She was wandering," he said, "near the dry creek. We thought she was worth something. Trade her back, get safe passage, get horses." White Bull's face barely changed, but the air around him went colder. "You put your hands on her?" he asked. The outlaw shook his head hard. No, we didn't touch her. We just chased her. She ran. We lost her in the storm." White Bull leaned in, eyes flat as flint. "You frightened her." The outlaw started to say something. An excuse, a justification, a half-formed lie, but White Bull cut it off with a look and stood. He spoke in Comanche. Two warriors hauled the bound man up by the arms and dragged him away behind a boulder. Mallister didn't move to watch. He turned his head toward the brightening horizon instead, jaw clenched tight. He'd seen enough death in his life to know when a man was about to stop being a problem. The sounds behind the rock didn't last long. Afterward, the canyon felt strangely empty, as if the morning air had more room in it. The campfire smoke thinned as the sun climbed, turning the dust into a pale gold veil. Horses shifted and snorted softly. Comanche warriors gathered themselves, calm returning the way it always does after something final has happened. White Bull came back to Mallister. "You could have stayed behind rocks.
he said softly. You did not. Mallister wiped at his bruised cheek, trying to clear dust from sweat. Rocks don't feed my horses. White Bull studied him for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised Mallister more than any arrow had. My people measure a man by what he does when he thinks no one will praise him. Mallister looked out at the rocks, at the last curls of wrong smoke. No one's praising anybody out here, he muttered. White Bull didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply turned and gave a quick gesture toward the open land beyond the canyon, where the path would lead back to the Comanche camp and to the council. Come, he said. Mallister followed, bruised and dusty, yet still alive, realizing the fight hadn't been the end of the night's judgment. It had only been the proof that the story was bigger than a barn, bigger than a lost child, bigger than one man's good intentions. Now the elders would hear it. And in the West, sometimes the only thing more dangerous than a gunfight is standing in front of a fire and letting strangers decide what you are.
The Comanche camp didn't look like any town Mallister had ever ridden through. There were no nailed-down streets, no fences pretending the world could be owned. The lodges sat in a wide, deliberate pattern near a ribbon of creek water, smoke rising in thin columns that smelled clean. Wood smoke, cooking smoke, the kind that meant people were living, not signaling. Mallister rode in at the center of a small escort, and every eye in that camp seemed to find him at once. Women stepped out from lodge flaps and went still. Children hovered behind legs, staring openly. Men watched with the quiet attention of people who've learned to measure strangers fast. Mallister kept his hands where they could be seen. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't wave. He just sat in the saddle, bruised and dusty from the canyon fight, trying not to look like a man who knew he didn't belong. White Bull rode ahead with his daughter. The girl sat close, wrapped in a robe, her posture steadier now. She looked less like someone rescued and more like someone returned. But Mallister could still see the memory of hunger in her face, the way her eyes kept checking the world, as if the world might change its mind. Broken Arrow rode behind, rigid as a fence post, Scar pulling his mouth into that permanent half-snarl. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. The look he gave Mallister did the talking. Not forgiven, not forgotten. They stopped near an open space in the center of camp, where a fire pit waited like an old judge. Mallister dismounted carefully, boots pressing into packed earth, and the escort closed around him in a loose half-circle, not grabbing him, not shoving him, just making it clear he wasn't wandering anywhere on his own. Then the council gathered. 7 elders sat in a semicircle around the central fire, faces lined like dry riverbeds, eyes bright and steady in the smoke. They didn't look surprised to see a white man standing there. They looked like men who'd lived long enough to be surprised by very little. Mallister stood alone in the center, hat in hand, feeling the heat of the fire on one side of his face and the weight of attention on the other. He'd been in fights, he'd stood down angry men before, but this was different. No shouting, no chaos, just silence and judgment. White Bull spoke first in Comanche, voice even and controlled. He didn't perform, he didn't posture, he told it straight. The storm, the missing child, the trail that led to Mallister's ranch. He spoke of food and shelter, of the torn cloth kept as proof. He spoke of the canyon and the outlaws and the beads on the stolen horse. Mallister understood almost none of the words, but he understood the rhythm. The story had weight in it. It landed like stones placed carefully. Then Broken Arrow stepped forward. His Comanche came faster, sharper. Even without translation, the shape of it was clear. Old laws, old wounds, the danger of letting mercy weaken the tribe. He pointed toward Mallister once, then down to the ground, an unmistakable gesture that didn't need language. Mallister's fingers tightened on the brim of his hat. He kept his face still. Out here, the wrong expression could turn a debate into a decision. White Bull answered Broken Arrow without raising his voice. Calm, firm, the sound of a chief holding a line. Broken Arrow's jaw worked like he wanted to bite through that line. Around the edge of the council space, a few younger warriors shifted and murmured, like wind moving through tall grass. Not open rebellion, but the restless sound of men who wanted a clean ending, blood for blood, and go home. Mallister stood there feeling time stretch. The fire cracked. Smoke drifted into the pale air. Somewhere beyond the circle, a horse snorted and stomped once, impatient. And then the girl stood up. She stepped into the firelight without looking back at her father, without checking if anyone approved. She was small, but she moved like she belonged in that space, like the story was hers to tell, not something men argued over. She began speaking in Comanche, slow at first, then steady, her voice carrying across the circle. She pointed to the horizon, then made a wandering motion with her hands, as if drawing her own lost path through the air. She mimed stumbling, thirst, and hunger. She cupped her hands as if drinking from a shallow creek. She mimed eating, then curling into herself to sleep, shivering. Mallister watched her and felt something tighten behind his ribs. I'd seen grown men lie with confidence,
What the girl did wasn't that. It was simple, it was exact. It had the blunt truth of a child who hadn't learned how to dress suffering up into something prettier. She spoke for a long time, minutes that felt like hours. She never once looked away from the elders, not once. The elders listened without interrupting. Their faces didn't soften, but their attention sharpened, like men leaning in to hear the part that matters. When the girl finally stopped, the oldest elder, hair white as ash, leaned forward slightly and asked her a single question. Just one. Quiet, but it held the weight of the entire circle. The girl answered immediately. No hesitation, no wavering. White Bull turned toward Mallister and translated, choosing his English carefully. He asked her if she believes you would do it again, White Bull said. If you would feed a Comanche child, give water, give shelter, even knowing what it could cost you. Mallister blinked. His mouth went dry. He thought of that morning by the creek bed, how the child had looked like she might fall apart if the wind blew harder. He thought of the necklace, the realization, the fear that came after. He thought of how fast a good deed turns into a noose when the wrong people see it. He looked at the girl. She met his eyes steadily, as if she'd already made her answer and was waiting for him to be honest about his. Mallister took a slow breath. I don't know what I'd do if I had time to think about the cost, he said, but I know what I did when I didn't. I saw a child dying and I couldn't leave her. White Bull translated, and the elder's eyes narrowed slightly like he was tasting the truth in the words. Then the elders leaned together. They spoke in low whispers, faces close, voices too quiet for Mallister to catch even a single tone. Mallister stood still, hat in hand, while the decision formed somewhere just out of reach. Finally, the white-haired elder pushed himself up to standing, slow, stiff, but steady. When he spoke, the entire space seemed to tighten around his voice. White Bull translated as the elder spoke. He says the prairie does not reward softness, White Bull said, but it remembers courage. Mallister felt his shoulders loose in a fraction. Not relief exactly, more like the first breath after being held underwater. Then the elder lifted one finger. There is a condition, White Bull translated. The fire popped and sent a small ribbon of sparks into the air. The sound was tiny, but it landed like punctuation. The elder's condition came out through White Bull in calm, firm English. If any of our people come to your door, lost, hungry, wounded, your door must not become a trap. You must do what you did for this child. Mallister stared at the ground for a beat, thinking about what that meant. Not in some heroic way, in the practical way a rancher thinks. Neighbors who would talk, men who would accuse, the danger that comes from being seen is different on the frontier. Then he nodded once. All right, I'll do it. Broken Arrow stepped forward, protesting in Comanche, voice sharp. A few younger men echoed him. The old instinct rose again. The easy answer, the bloody answer. Before White Bull could speak, the girl turned toward Broken Arrow, and whatever she said to him came fast and pointed. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She spoke like someone who had been afraid, survived it, and decided fear wasn't allowed to do the talking anymore. Broken Arrow's expression changed in small steps. Anger, confusion, something like reluctant shame. He looked away first, jaw clenched, like it cost him something. The elder watched all of it, then spoke one last time. White Bull turned it slowly. No man leaves this fire satisfied, he said. That is how you know the decision is not only for one man. The council began to break apart, people moving away in quiet clusters. The camp didn't suddenly become friendly. The air didn't turn warm, but something had shifted. A war party that arrived expecting certainty had been forced to live with something messier. A story where mercy had been offered, and mercy had been answered, on terms that could hold a people together. White Bull stepped beside Mallister as the last of the elders turned away. You will ride back with an escort, he said, so no young fool decides to be brave alone. Mallister gave a tired nod. I appreciate it. White Bull's face didn't soften, but his eyes held steady. Nearby, the girl approached Mallister and said one careful word in broken English, like she practiced it in secret. Thank you. Mallister's throat tightened. He nodded, because sometimes a man's voice fails at the worst possible time. The girl added quieter. Now, I help you. And Mallister understood then that this wasn't just about living through a night. It was about carrying a promise back into the same hard country where people prefer simple stories. Good and bad, friend and enemy, because simple stories fit easier inside fear.